In the final days of World War II in Europe, as Berlin was besieged and the remnants of the Third Reich crumbled, it was believed that every act of combat was aimed at the singular noble goal of ending the conflict and freeing the prisoners. Yet in the final hours of that chaos, one of the war's most horrific humanitarian tragedies occurred. An event almost erased from collective memory, the sinking of the Cap Arcona. This catastrophe was not caused by a U-boat torpedo or a final brutal Nazi attack. It was an unintentional act of destruction carried out by the Allied forces themselves. On May 3, 1945, just days before Germany's unconditional surrender aircraft from Britain's Royal Air Force, RAF, attacked and sank 3 massive ships in the Bay of Lübeck in the Baltic Sea. Aboard those vessels were not fleeing German troops but thousands of prisoners from concentration camps, including Neuengamme and Stutthof, who were being evacuated in what the Nazis called death marches. The crushing paradox here is that the Allied forces attempting to rescue and liberate became the direct cause of death for thousands of innocent victims of the very fascist regime they were fighting to defeat. An estimated 7,000 to 8,000 prisoners perished in the sinking of the Cap Arcona, Tilbeck and Deutschland. It was one of the worst maritime disasters in history, and an incident both Britain and Germany were quick to bury. Why did this tragedy happen? Official history celebrates victory and liberation, but it often stays silent on the terrible mistakes born of confusion, faulty intelligence and the desperate chaos of the final days. Was it merely a fatal intelligence failure, or was there a moral grey zone in the decision to attack without thoroughly verifying the target? And what happened to the exhausted prisoners who had just escaped the hell of the camps, only to face death from the sky by the very people who were supposed to be their savior? The context of late April and early May 1945 was one of extreme tension. The Nazis were frantically trying to erase all evidence of their crimes, driving prisoners in forced marches and eventually herding them onto ships with the intent of letting them die at sea or using them as human shields. The Allies, overwhelmed with conflicting intelligence, were hunting any moving target in the Baltic. Today we are reopening the files to find the truth, what really happened. The historical backdrop to the Cap Arcona tragedy is the chaos and desperation of the war's final weeks. As Allied forces advanced, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, ordered the evacuation of all prisoners from camps near the front lines, including Neuengamme. The SS goal was to prevent any witnesses from falling into Allied hands to testify about war crimes. Tens of thousands of prisoners, already skeletal from starvation and disease, were forced onto death marches toward unoccupied areas. Eventually, a massive number were funneled to the Bay of Lübeck, where the SS decided to cram them onto large ships for deliberate destruction, either by scuttling or burning to dispose of the evidence. The ships used, including the Cap Arcona, a former luxury liner the SS had used for propaganda films. The Tilbeck and the Deutschland were not warships, but all transport and passenger vessels. The SS guards forced the prisoners into the crowded, foul-smelling holds with no food or water. The intelligence failure was the critical element. Allied command was frantically receiving intelligence that the ships were being used to evacuate German troops, specifically high-ranking SS officers, from Norway and Denmark back to Germany, or to transport reinforcements to coastal defenses. Swedish intelligence did attempt to warn the Allies that prisoners were aboard, but in the overwhelming confusion and complex relay of information, the warning was either dismissed or tragically lost. On May 3, 1945, RAF Hawker. Typhoon squadrons, part of the 2nd Tactical Air Force, were ordered to hunt and destroy any German shipping targets in the Bay of Lübeck. The tactical aim was to prevent any last-ditch German attempts to retreat or reinforce. The RAF pilots were instructed to attack any vessel flying a German flag or showing military markings. At approximately 2:30 p.m. the attack began. The official RAF history records a successful attack that prevented the evacuation of German troops. The reality, however, was a massacre. The Typhoons attacked with rockets and machine guns. When the Cap Arcona was hit, it quickly caught fire and listed. Thousands of prisoners trapped below deck had no chance of escape. The panic worsened as the SS guards, many dressed in naval uniforms to blend in, opened fire on any prisoner attempting to swim to safety. They were being shot by desperate German soldiers, burned by Allied rockets and machine guns from the air. The story of Heinz, a young Polish prisoner, is one of the few survivor accounts. He was jammed in the filthy hold of the Cap Arcona. When the attack started, he heard the explosions followed by terrifying screams. Heinz and a few others managed to break out swimming in the frigid Baltic waters. He recounted the horrific sight of fellow prisoners being shot by the SS as they clung to wreckage. The most painful realization was the sound of the planes overhead. We thought it was rescue. Then we realized they were shooting at us. There was no escaping death by any means. The Thielbeck, the smaller ship, sank in just 20 minutes. Out of 2,800 prisoners aboard, only around 50 survived. As the few lucky prisoners swam to the nearby shore of Neustadt, they were captured and shot by local SS units and Hitler Youth. An estimated 300 prisoners were killed on the beach or in the nearby woods before the British Army finally arrived in force. The Cap Arcona tragedy was a horrific intersection of Nazi brutality and Allied tactical error, turning the hope of freedom into the final nightmare. The full truth of the Cap Arcona tragedy only emerged much later, when the British 11th Armoured Division rolled into the Bay of Lübeck area on May 4, 1945. They were confronted with a horrific scene, thousands of bodies washing ashore and the capsized hulk of the Cap Arcona protruding from the water. British officers quickly grasped the scale of the disaster and the terrible mistake that had occurred. An estimated 7,000 to 8,000 prisoners, mostly Russian, Polish, French and German, had perished, a number exceeding the total casualties on two major British battleships combined during World War I. Accounting for the precise identity and cause of death was virtually impossible due to the chaos and the SS's destruction of records. Immediately after the incident, Allied command worked to downplay the event, explaining it as an unavoidable accident of war. Our AF records were classified and sealed for decades. The official rationale was that intelligence had identified the ships as carrying armed German troops, and pilots could not clearly see any signs of prisoners from their attack altitude and speed. However, a moral grey zone remains. At that moment, British pilots were under clear orders. Any German vessel moving in the Baltic was a legitimate target. The ships did not fly flags, indicating they carried POWs, as the SS had deliberately prevented this. But should such a large passenger vessel be attacked without stricter close-range reconnaissance or target verification, especially with the war in its final hours and intelligence about camp evacuations already circulating? The SS had cynically and intentionally used the prisoners as human shields. They knew that placing thousands of human lives on board made the targets complicated and risked an Allied mistake. For the few survivors, their story was a double accusation. They testified to the brutality of the SS who shot them as they tried to escape fire and water, and simultaneously they struggled with the reality that their supposed liberators were the ones who delivered the final blow. The incident became a lasting stain on the British war record and a deep trauma for the survivors. After the war, neither the West German nor the East German governments chose to highlight the tragedy extensively. For West Germany, it complicated the narrative of liberation. For East Germany, the story of political prisoners being killed by Western forces did not fit their anti-Western propaganda. As a result, the Cap Arcona tragedy sank into decades of silence. To this day, the wreck of the Cap Arcona remains submerged in the Bay of Lübeck, a cold monument to the confusion and futility of war. The unrecovered bodies of the prisoners remain within the hulk. Conclusion. The Cap Arcona tragedy is a complex and devastating incident, illustrating the chaos and terrible price of war where good intentions can lead to catastrophic results. It was not a simple intelligence error by the RAF, it was the result of the SS's calculated atrocity in using human shields, combined with the extreme urgency and lack of target verification in a desperate combat situation. Thousands of prisoners, having endured the hell of the concentration camps, died at the hands of the very people meant to save them. The Cap Arcona incident poses a critical philosophical question. Can ethical standards be maintained in the most chaotic moments of war, or will strategic pragmatism always rule, leading to irreparable tragic mistakes? Follow the channel to keep uncovering the hidden files of history.